you been? I know it's been quite a while before I gave you some insights on development, but here I am. It's just because I've been up and down, busy here and there, but here we are, ready to roll, and today we are going to talk about a very interesting topic. But before we talk about our today's topic, I have a friend of mine here and a guest whom I'm honored to host, a fellow Chelsea fan, and I'm honored to have him on the show. I'll give him a few minutes to introduce himself, and then we can get started.
Thank you, Elka, for having me. It's a pleasure to join you in this very vibrant show. I'm always happy to join you and share my thoughts on different issues, and I am looking forward to share my opinions and views on this topic that is very interesting, timely, and relevant in the context of African development. And so I am looking forward to have a very lively discussion, as always. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Martin. So he has touched a little bit on what we're going to talk about today. And to start us off, we're going to discuss about this concept, or rather this narrative of Africa rising. It's a concept that has really gained momentum, or rather has gained a lot of traction. Yeah. So we see many people talking about Africa rising. Yeah.
Yes.
But when you read the book by Paul Collier, I have the book here. This is it. So according to this book, we have 7 billion poor people living in coexistence with 1 billion rich people. So, and he averts that the developing countries, especially those concentrated in Africa and Central Asia, continue to fall behind. So, are we seeing a contradiction between the narrative of Africa rising and also having some scholars such as Paul saying Africa continues to lag behind and fall apart?
I think that is a very good question. On whether it is a contradiction or not, it really depends on the metrics that these different commentators or authors or scholars have used to measure Africans' rise or lack thereof. Yeah? But there are some facts that are undeniable. We always say that we can have our own set of opinions but not our own set of facts. If you look at the percentage of poor people living around or below the poverty line in Africa, it continues to be high. So if you met a person who tells you, I do not think Africa is rising because it still has a very huge population that is, plagued by poverty, then that person is right. But if you also find another commentator who tells you he is looking at this thing, comparatively, saying, before 2000, we had all these issues. We were having issues of disease and conflict, very instability. But in the 21st century, there is a sense in which we are seeing, mobility. We see infrastructure projects, happening. We see a lot of democratic transitions happening. We see Africa now, we see a lot of focus in terms of investment, foreign direct investments coming into Africa. So, in a sense, that person could also be right in asserting that, Africa is rising. So, I could say it's just an issue of metrics, the lenses that we are using to look at this rise, that is where the issue is. But there are things that we can agree on, and once we agree on those things, then we can have a discussion that allows us to converge somewhere, So I think it's an issue. It's
basically depends on where one
sees. Yes, it depends on who is telling the story.
Yeah. Sure. So again, while working towards developing Africa, or rather this concept of Africa rising, the pursuit has been really to narrow the gap between the global north and the global south. Yeah. Do you think we are almost achieving narrowing the gap between the global north or the global south, or rather, are we doing something wrong when we say we want to narrow this gap?
Comparing ourselves to other people, especially those that we think have been there and have done it, is not bad, but it calls for a lot of sobriety and focus. Because we have a certain benchmark, That is a good thing, but I think it is not very advisable. It is not something that I would encourage. I would say Africa should focus a lot on its problems. That is what we should compete with. How much we are able to deal with those problems should be our benchmark. If, for instance, it's an issue of poverty, what poverty is there in the West? The numbers are very low. So can we compare ourselves with the West in terms of, eradicating poverty? Some of us cannot even tell you when America, for example, or Europe was able to overcome poverty in their countries or in their continent. So we are even pursuing a story that we do not understand fully. What we understand as Africans are our problems.
But the thing is, we are not comparing ourselves with them at the moment. You see, like I'll use the Rosto's model of modernization.
Yes.
The way he puts it, where Africa is at the moment, at a particular point in time, the developed countries and especially the West, the US was there. Yeah? So they had the traditional stage where there was hunting and gathering, and then they came to the takeoff, and then all those, the 5 processes up to the age of maturation. So that is what has been like dictated for African countries as well, that if we go through this path of development, then we are going to catch up with the Western countries.
The most likely result will be like what the West experienced.
Exactly. That is what has been argued. But in your opinion, do you think really that should be the way for African countries?
Ideally, there is no problem of following that path. There is no problem of following tried and tested developmental paths. There is no problem at all.
Yes.
What I would want to encourage as we pursue these developmental models that have been tried and tested elsewhere, be it in the West, be it in Asia, we must always have very sharp focus on what our problems are. Because you see, our pursuit of development must be in response to our problems. We cannot just pursue development for the sake of it or for purposes of just catching up with the West. Because even in the West, there are countries that are very rich, but there exist very huge disparities in their societies. Would you want to achieve a certain, for instance, if we take per capita income, for example, say we want to achieve a per capita income like America, like Canada, like Australia. But yet, we still are going to, once we have achieved that, because you see the way you compete these things, you do not interrogate very deeply what they mean. You can have that level of per capita income, but you still have people that are poor, who cannot access health, care, who cannot get education, security and housing, for instance, because those are some of the problems that are in the West. As we pursue this development, let this development be in response to our problems, so that there has to be a causal link between development goals and dealing with our problems, for instance, the problem of poverty, you see, so that whatever development model we pursue, it is going to help us deal with our systemic problems. That is what I am encouraging. Let us not just pursue development for the sake of it. It has to have meaning for Africans.
So the bottom line is we should not transpose the theories and models from the West into the African setting.
We cannot copy and paste blindly. We have to ask what works for us. That is what we must focus on.
Okay. That's interesting discussion. We take a short break, but do not leave. You can only take a sip of water, then come back. As we come back, it will be so interesting to find out the roadmap to development for Africa. See you. Welcome back, viewers. And so we've talked about development, But we might be talking about development when in real sense many of us do not understand what development is. So Martin, what are some of the metrics or rather indices that can be used to measure development?
That is a very good question. It is tied to what I said, that in pursuing development, Africa should really be focused on pursuing development in response, or rather it should be driven by its problems. We all know that Africa has problem of unemployment, it's very high. We also know that Africa has the issue of infrastructure. Our infrastructure is not very well, developed. So that is one issue. Issues of security are also very important. Then issues of human issues like access to water, access to food, the issue of disease burden, the burden of disease. Africa still has to deal with all these, malaria, TB, and other diseases that in other parts of the world are a thing of the past. So if we are able to deal with these problems, then we can sit back and say, no, we are developing, we are raising, because we have been able to deal with some of these challenges. Actually, once we are able to confront these issues successively, then it is going to be said that Africa is now almost at par with other parts of the world, because we have been able to overcome problems that other people overcame long time ago. But you can pursue development that does not allow you or help you to deal with these problems. If you pursue that kind of development, then I do not think it is positive. It is very negative.
Okay. So if my grandmother in the village can access the healthcare, can access clean water, food, good infrastructure when she's moving around, then...
And if her grandchildren are able to access quality education, and after they have gone to school, they are also able to find employment. And
that is when we will say we have developed.
Yes.
Okay. So do you think, or rather, we can emulate some models? We talked about the modernization model, which is not so... Okay, we talked about not transposing whatever was done in the West into Africa. But we have other models that have worked for some African states. The developmental state model, the model that has worked for Botswana, our neighbor here. It has worked for Japan, for China,
Singapore,
South Korea. Do you think it would be an ideal model for African countries to use?
There is a reason why a lot of people like to propose that model of development to Africa. Part of the reason is very sentimental, but it's also very factual. Because when you look at countries like South Korea, countries like China, countries like Singapore, countries like Malaysia, one of the realities is that when Africa was still under the yoke of colonialism, some of these countries were also under colonialism.
Yes.
That is point number one. So if you go back to 1960s, those countries, or in 1950s, they were still
the same level.
Yeah. But also economically, because of colonialism, they were at the same level.
Yes.
They had all these problems, but they have been able to deal with these problems. And what has helped them deal with these problems? It is pursuing a model that you have called the developmental state model. If you allow me, let me describe or define what a developmental state model is.
Sure.
It is a model of development where state, it is almost actually like an antithesis of the neoliberal economic, school of thought, because, neoliberal economic school of thought says that there should be minimal intervention by the state in economic planning and management. But now the developmental state is like an antithesis of this one, because it encourages a greater role by the state in economic planning and management. Basically, the state is invited to take a leading role in deciding where development is going to happen. What projects should we invest in? What programs should we invest in? And therefore it is able to direct even the private sector to tell them, bring your investment, bring your capital, bring your resources. But once you bring those resources, our focus is in these areas, is in projects A, it is in programs B. So that is what developmental state model is, you know, it is basically where state has a very great, has a leading role, or a very, has a bigger role in deciding where investments should go.
Yeah.
So it's like, it does not like prescribe, you know, in saying that we are going to do this, but it just gives a direction, a sense of direction. For instance, if it's infrastructure, then it is infrastructure. If it's in ICT, ICT. Yes. If it's in agriculture, this is what we are going to do.
Yeah.
That is basically it. But of course, there are conditions that have to be met, or rather it is predicated on certain assumptions for it to work perfectly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you can take us through these conditions.
So that is the overarching idea, the idea of the state intervening or taking a leading role in economic planning and management. But there are certain assumptions that are made that if followed or if met, the developmental state model then is able to work perfectly. One of them is that the elite, it is always assumed that for developmental state model to work, the elite must put national interest before personal interest. Sometimes you find contradictions. You will find countries who say that, you know, we are pursuing a developmental state model, and yet the elite in that country
have
put
their
personal interest before
national interest.
If that happens, then the developmental state model is not going to be as effective.
Yeah.
Then number two, bureaucracy must be very effective.
And minimal.
And minimal.
Yeah.
The bureaucracy that is there in the state must be very effective. You know, you all know the story of bureaucracies in Africa, not just in Africa, everywhere in the world. Bureaucracies are one of the major challenges that stand in the way of states in achieving goals, whether developmental or otherwise, political or otherwise. Yeah. So it is assumed that for this model to work, then the bureaucracy must be very efficient. So if that means then you make it very lean, then that is what should be pursued. That is about democracy.
And especially for export-led
Yeah. Then the other condition is that the private sector, because it is the private sector's resources or capital that will be driving development, they are always given an opportunity to give their opinions on some of these programs, yeah? Especially where there is an inconsistency, or where there are inconsistencies between their capital and the projects or programs. For instance, if they sense that if we put our resources or our capital in these programs, then there is a chance that we are going to lose our money or our resources. Then a developmental state model presupposes that once that happens, these people, the private sector, are going to be given an opportunity to give their input and say, we think we are not doing so well.
Yeah.
Can we make these and these changes? And once they have such input, they are going to be given audience. That is another condition that must be met. The other thing that the developmental state model must, the other condition that it must meet for it to work effectively, the issues of governance and democracy and rule of law must be there. You know, they must be there. So it is not a ticket to dictatorship. It is not a ticket to opacity in governance. It is not a ticket to lack of rule of law. So it must be supported by, you know, openness. It must be supported by consensus building. It must be supported by rule of law. And you know, participation of the people. So those are some of the conditions that must be met for this model to work. And once it works, like we have seen in Japan, like we have seen in South Korea and in Singapore and in Malaysia,
the Asian tigers, yeah.
African countries or even in the South, global South, they are going to benefit a great deal from, you know, pursuing such a developmental state model. Yeah.
Interesting. So basically that's the roadmap to Africa's development and a way of avoiding falling back and falling apart.
Lastly, I think this is a point that I had forgotten. There must be a deliberate effort to create or to capacitate institutions, particularly institutions of governance. All these things cannot work if they are not supported by effective institutions. So you must endeavor to create institutions that work, that are not personality based, such that if a person exits, then that institution is not going to work.
Yes.
So there must be deliberate effort to invest in building of institutions to capacitate them. And here perhaps you could have the idea of even, importing issues of corporate governance into such institutions. So you must endeavor to create institutions. So the conditions are, you build the institutions, then there has to be proper governance and leadership. There has to be, the private sector has to be given audience anytime they feel like they need to ventilate or to give their input. Then the bureaucracy must be effective, and lastly, the elite must have the interest of the nation before their own personal interest. Once those conditions are met, then the developmental state model is going to work perfectly.
Wow, interesting. That was so educative, that was rich and resourceful. So viewers, I hope you got 1 or 2 points there, especially on the point of developmental state model. And I hope this is a model that can be adopted by our development experts. Until next time, see you, but do not forget to subscribe, to like and share. Bye bye, take care of yourselves amid the chilly Nairobi weather.